Welcome back to WSE English Story, where learning English becomes a journey into the heart of human courage and history. Dear learners, today we're going to meet a man who led his nation through its darkest hours, not once, but twice. His name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, often called FDR. He was the 32nd President of the United States, and he carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders during two of the most difficult chapters in human history, the Great Depression and World War II. But this story is not just about politics or war. It's about a man who refused to surrender, even when fate tried to break him. Paralyzed from the waist down by polio, Roosevelt lost the ability to walk, yet somehow, he found the strength to help millions of others stand again. His story is a reminder that true power doesn't come from the body, it comes from the mind and spirit. Through this story, you'll not only improve your English, but also discover the values of hope, leadership, and unyielding resolve, the same qualities that helped Roosevelt turn despair into strength and lead a wounded nation toward recovery and victory. If you'd like to support our work, you're welcome to like, comment, share, or join us. Your support truly helps us continue creating meaningful stories for learners like you. So, get ready for a powerful journey through courage, compassion, and destiny. Let's begin the story of Franklin D. Roosevelt, the president who carried America through storms and into the light. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born on January 30th, 1882, in a large, peaceful estate along the Hudson River in Hyde Park, New York. The world he entered was one of comfort, wealth, and old traditions. His family belonged to America's upper class, people who lived in elegant homes, far from the struggles of everyday workers. His father, James Roosevelt, was a prosperous businessman and landowner. His mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, came from another distinguished family. From birth, Franklin was surrounded by privilege, love, and security, a world that seemed untouched by hardship. Yet, this sheltered beginning would one day stand in sharp contrast to the storms that awaited him. Young Franklin grew up believing that life was predictable, that good manners and responsibility were the cornerstones of leadership. He was educated by private tutors and later attended Groton School, an elite preparatory academy known for shaping the sons of America's most powerful families. There, the headmaster often reminded the boys, much is expected from those to whom much has been given. That idea, the moral duty to serve others, began to take root in Franklin's heart. After Groton, Roosevelt went on to study at Harvard University, where he admired his distant cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, the energetic and reform-minded president who inspired a generation. Franklin watched how Theodore's courage and confidence electrified the nation, and deep down, he dreamed of following the same path, not for fame, but to make a difference. At this time, America itself was transforming. The early 1900s brought the birth of the modern age, skyscrapers rising, automobiles roaring through city streets, and waves of immigrants filling the ports of New York. The promise of the American dream was alive, but not for everyone. Farmers struggled, factory workers toiled for little pay, and millions faced poverty hidden behind the glitter of progress. In this world of contrast, between wealth and poverty, privilege and pain, Franklin's worldview began to shift. He started to realize that leadership was not about comfort, but about responsibility. As he entered politics, first as a New York State senator, he discovered that the people who needed the most help were not those he grew up with, but those who had never known security. And yet, destiny had something unimaginable in store for him, something that would challenge not just his ideals, but his very ability to stand, to move, and to lead. Because before Franklin Roosevelt could lead a nation through its suffering, he would first have to face the collapse of his own world. In the early 1920s, Franklin D. Roosevelt seemed to have everything a man could dream of: charm, ambition, a growing political career, and a loving family. He had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I, earning a reputation for his energy and intelligence. Many believed he was destined to become president one day, just like his cousin Theodore. The world saw him as a man in motion, confident, athletic, full of life. He loved sailing on the Hudson, swimming in cold waters, and walking with his head held high. But life, as it often does, was about to test the strength beneath that bright surface. In the summer of 1921, while vacationing at his family retreat on Campobello Island, Roosevelt began to feel an unusual weakness in his legs. He thought it was just fatigue from swimming or overwork. Yet within days, the weakness spread. His legs became numb. He couldn't stand. Then came the fever, the pain, the terrifying loss of control. The doctors gave the diagnosis: poliomyelitis, or polio, a disease that could strike anyone, but left many paralyzed for life. For a man who had built his identity on action and confidence, this was a cruel blow. The once vigorous Roosevelt was suddenly trapped in a body that would no longer obey him. He tried every treatment imaginable: massages, electrical therapy, warm baths, but nothing restored the use of his legs. When he realized that he would never walk again unaided, despair set in. In the eyes of society, his career was over. The public didn't want to see weakness in a leader. Friends urged him to retire from politics and live quietly. Even within his party, whispers began: Franklin Roosevelt, the rising star, had fallen. But inside, something unexpected was happening. The man who had once relied on privilege and optimism was forced to confront the deeper meaning of strength. He began to see that suffering could shape compassion, and that leadership meant standing tall, even when you could not stand at all. During those dark years, he withdrew from public life, spending much of his time in Warm Springs, Georgia, a small town known for its warm mineral waters. There, among people who were also struggling with polio, Roosevelt found something he had never truly known before: equality through pain. For the first time, he wasn't the governor's son, the Harvard graduate, or the future president. He was simply a man fighting to move his legs like everyone else. That place became his refuge, and later, his mission. He bought the property, turning it into a rehabilitation center for others who suffered as he did. In the laughter, hope, and courage of those patients, he rediscovered purpose. And while his body remained bound by steel braces, his spirit began to rise. By 1928, Roosevelt had made a decision that shocked even his closest friends: he would return to politics. The man who could not walk would stand again before the people, not with his legs, but with his will. But could America, still bound by prejudice and doubt, believe in a man who had lost the power to walk, yet promised to lead them forward? When Franklin Roosevelt returned to public life, many doubted him. To the political world of the 1920s, paralysis symbolized weakness, and weakness had no place in politics. But Roosevelt refused to accept that. Behind his calm smile was an unshakable determination. He learned to stand with the help of metal braces, to walk a few steps with crutches, and to use his upper body strength to project confidence. Every public appearance was carefully choreographed so that the audience never saw the full extent of his condition. When he entered a room, people saw not a crippled man, but a leader. In 1928, he decided to run for governor of New York. Many thought it was madness. Even some of his allies whispered that the voters would never elect a man who couldn't walk. But Roosevelt had learned something vital from his years in pain: courage is contagious. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, a woman of deep compassion and independence, became his greatest ally. She traveled across the state, meeting citizens, listening to their struggles, and sharing Franklin's vision of renewal. Together, they became an unstoppable team, one leading with words, the other with empathy. Roosevelt's campaign was bold. He spoke not as a man of privilege, but as someone who understood hardship. When the election results came in, he had won. Against all expectations, Franklin D. Roosevelt became the governor of New York, marking the first great step in his return to power. As governor, he faced a state in turmoil. The economy was weakening, farmers were desperate, and unemployment was rising. Then, in 1929, the unthinkable happened. The stock market crashed, plunging the entire nation into the Great Depression. Millions lost their jobs, their homes, their hope. People lined up for bread, children went hungry, and once thriving cities fell silent. This was the America that Roosevelt would soon be called to lead. But before that, he had to prove he could turn vision into action. In New York, he launched programs to provide relief for the unemployed, help farmers, and restore confidence in government. These little experiments, as he called them, became the foundation for what would later be known as the New Deal, a massive national effort to rebuild America from the ground up. During these years, Roosevelt's leadership began to evolve. Gone was the polished young man shaped by wealth and tradition. In his place stood a leader who spoke directly to the hearts of ordinary people, the farmers, the factory workers, the forgotten families. He learned to communicate with warmth, optimism, and simplicity. He would often say, "The only limit to our realization of tomorrow will be our doubts of today." But behind the confident speeches and smiling photos, the struggle was constant. Every morning, he was lifted from bed and strapped into his braces. Every step was an act of willpower. Yet he never complained. When asked how he managed to keep his faith, Roosevelt once replied, "When you come to the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on." By 1932, the Great Depression had spread across the nation. Banks were failing, unemployment had reached unimaginable levels, and despair hung like a shadow over America. People were desperate for hope, for a leader who could not just talk about recovery, but embody it. And then came the moment that would define him forever. Roosevelt announced his candidacy for President of the United States. His voice, strong and full of conviction, echoed across the radio, "I pledge you, I pledge myself, to a new deal for the American people." The nation was ready for change. They saw in him not a disabled man, but a symbol, someone who had fallen and risen again. As he prepared to enter the White House, Roosevelt knew the road ahead would be long, dangerous, and full of resistance. But he also knew that the lessons of pain, patience, and courage had prepared him for what was to come. Because now, it was not just about his recovery. It was about the recovery of an entire nation. On March 4, 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before the American people to take the oath of office as the 32nd President of the United States. The scene was unforgettable. The country lay in ruin. Banks had collapsed, factories stood silent, and more than 13 million Americans were unemployed. Families had lost everything. Lines for bread stretched across city blocks. Fear ruled the nation. The new president, unable to stand without help, was carried to the podium and steadied by his son. The air was cold and heavy with despair. Then, Roosevelt's voice rose, firm, clear, and filled with faith. "Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. That sentence ignited something deep within the American spirit. It wasn't just a speech, it was a lifeline. Roosevelt knew that before rebuilding banks, he had to rebuild courage. And that day, he began transforming fear into faith. Immediately after taking office, he acted with lightning speed. Within the first 100 days, Roosevelt signed a wave of new laws that changed the nation's direction. Banks reopened under federal protection, millions were put to work building roads, bridges, and parks through programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, and the Public Works Administration, PWA. He created the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, to bring electricity and jobs to the poorest regions of the South. For the first time, the government became a force for hope rather than bureaucracy. But Roosevelt's true genius was not only in policy, it was in his ability to connect emotionally with the people. Through his fireside chats, a series of radio broadcasts, he spoke to Americans as if he were sitting in their living room. His warm, reassuring voice turned national panic into collective purpose. He explained complex economic programs in simple, human terms. He told them, "Your government is taking action. Together, we will recover." And people believed him. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Confidence returned. Banks began to reopen. For the first time in years, Americans dared to hope. Yet Roosevelt's road was not free of obstacles. The wealthy and powerful resisted his reforms, accusing him of socialism. Some business leaders tried to discredit him. Others claimed he was destroying capitalism. But Roosevelt stood firm. He once told his critics, "I welcome their hatred," and continued his work. To him, the well-being of the people mattered more than the approval of the privileged. By 1936, when he ran for re-election, Roosevelt was not just a president, he was the voice of a nation reborn. The people who had once been broken now stood taller. The New Deal had not solved every problem, but it had restored faith in democracy itself. Roosevelt won in a landslide. But fate, as always, had another storm waiting. Across the ocean, a new threat was rising, one far darker than economic depression. In Europe, Adolf Hitler had seized power in Germany. In Asia, Japan was expanding aggressively. The world was moving toward a new, even more terrifying conflict. At first, the American people wanted no part in another war. They had suffered enough. But Roosevelt, ever watchful, understood what was coming. He strengthened the military, supported allies quietly, and began preparing the nation mentally and industrially for the possibility of war. Then, on December 7, 1941, everything changed. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, destroying much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. More than 2,000 Americans were killed. The next day, Roosevelt went before Congress and delivered one of the most powerful speeches in American history. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The world that had once looked to Roosevelt for economic salvation now looked to him for strength in war. The Great Depression had tested his compassion. Now, World War II would test his courage. Would the man who had once fought to stand on his own legs now have the strength to help the world stand against tyranny? The answer would define not only his legacy, but the fate of freedom itself. The attack on Pearl Harbor jolted the United States into a new reality. Overnight, a nation that had struggled to recover from economic collapse was thrust into the largest and deadliest war in human history. Factories that once made cars began producing tanks and aircraft. Young men who once stood in bread lines now marched into battle. Across every town and city, the echo of Roosevelt's voice guided them. We are going to win the war, and we are going to win the peace that follows. For Franklin D. Roosevelt, it was the ultimate test, not only of leadership, but of endurance. His health was already fragile. The strain of constant decision-making, long hours, and the immense emotional burden began to wear on him. Yet he refused to slow down. While others slept, he read reports, met with generals, and planned strategies. He knew that if he faltered, freedom itself might perish. Roosevelt became the central figure of the Allied alliance, alongside Winston Churchill of Britain and later Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. Together, they formed an uneasy but necessary partnership to defeat the Axis powers. These men represented different worlds, different values, but shared one desperate goal: survival. In January 1943, at the Casablanca Conference, Roosevelt and Churchill announced that they would accept nothing less than the unconditional surrender of Germany, Italy, and Japan. It was a declaration of total resolve. But behind that calm determination was a man whose body was failing. He hid his pain behind smiles, his weakness behind powerful words. No photograph was ever allowed to show him in his wheelchair. He wanted America, and the world, to see not a crippled man, but an unbreakable leader. As the war intensified, Roosevelt made choices that weighed heavily on his conscience. He had to send millions of young Americans into deadly battles, across North Africa, Italy, the Pacific, and finally into the heart of Europe. Every life lost burdened him deeply. Eleanor later said that the war aged him beyond recognition, but that he never once expressed regret for his duty. He carried the sorrow of the world, she wrote, but he never let it crush him. Then came D-Day, June 6, 1944. On that morning, Allied forces launched the largest amphibious invasion in history, storming the beaches of Normandy to liberate Europe from Nazi control. Roosevelt didn't deliver a triumphant speech that day. Instead, he led the nation in prayer. Over the radio, his calm, solemn voice filled every home. Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor. They fight to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization. Millions listened in silence. It was not the voice of a politician. It was the voice of a father, a believer, a man who knew the price of freedom. By 1944, the tide of war had turned in favor of the Allies. But Roosevelt himself was weakening. Years of stress and illness were taking their toll. His doctors urged him to rest, but he refused. When asked why he kept pushing, he answered simply, "Because I cannot abandon the work while others are still dying for it." That same year, Roosevelt ran for an unprecedented fourth term as president. No one before or since has ever done so. Many wondered why he didn't step aside. But the people, seeing the war still raging, placed their faith in him once more. They didn't vote for the man in the wheelchair, they voted for the strength behind it. Behind the scenes, he began planning for a world after war. He dreamed of a lasting peace, one that would prevent future generations from enduring such suffering. This dream took shape as the idea for a new international organization, the United Nations. He envisioned a world bound by cooperation, not conflict. But as victory approached, his body began to fail. Those closest to him noticed the gray in his face, the fatigue in his eyes. He had given everything, his energy, his strength, his health, to keep democracy alive. One might ask, would you have the courage to give your life to a cause greater than yourself? Franklin D. Roosevelt did. And in doing so, he changed the destiny of the free world. In the final months of World War II, the weight of history rested heavily upon Franklin D. Roosevelt's frail shoulders. The Allied armies were closing in on victory. In Europe, Nazi Germany was collapsing under the relentless advance of American, British, and Soviet forces. In the Pacific, island after island was being reclaimed from Japanese control. The world had begun to glimpse the end of darkness, but for Roosevelt, the light was dimming. By early 1945, his health had sharply declined. Those closest to him noticed how thin he had become, how pale his face looked. He tired easily, yet his mind burned with purpose. He traveled one last time to Yalta, in the Crimea, to meet Churchill and Stalin. There, despite exhaustion, he discussed the future of a post-war world, how nations could coexist in peace, how the mistakes of the past could be avoided. He believed the coming peace must rest on cooperation and collective security, not on revenge. Out of this vision emerged the blueprint for the United Nations, an organization meant to protect future generations from the horrors of global war. When he returned home, he addressed Congress, his voice frail but steady. The structure of world peace cannot be the work of one man, or one party, or one nation. It must be a peace which rests on the cooperative effort of the whole world. Those words, spoken by a man on the edge of death, became the moral foundation of a new era. But Roosevelt's true victory was not just in war or diplomacy. His greatest achievement lay in how he had transformed the American spirit. When he took office in 1933, the nation had been broken and afraid. When he died 12 years later, America had not only recovered, it had become the strongest nation on earth. Under his leadership, more than 11 million people found jobs through his New Deal programs. The Social Security Act of 1935 gave workers security in old age. Banking reforms restored trust in the financial system. Roads, dams, schools, and hospitals were built across the country, not just as infrastructure, but as symbols of a new promise. Roosevelt's government gave ordinary Americans something they had lost during the Depression: dignity. And beyond the statistics, there was something deeper, a renewal of belief. Through his fireside chats, Roosevelt had spoken directly to the hearts of millions, teaching them to believe again in themselves, in democracy, and in the power of unity. He had proven that compassion and strength were not opposites, but partners in leadership. In April 1945, as Allied troops closed in on Berlin, Roosevelt retreated to Warm Springs, the place where his journey of resilience had begun decades earlier. He had come full circle, from the man who had lost the use of his legs to the leader who helped the world stand. On April 12, 1945, while working on a speech meant for the founding of the United Nations, he suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage and passed away. His final words were simple: "I have a terrific headache." When the news broke, the nation fell silent. Men and women wept in the streets. Soldiers, hardened by war, paused in grief. Churchill mourned his dear friend, and Stalin called him the greatest statesman of our time. As the world honored him, one truth became clear: Franklin D. Roosevelt had not merely led America, he had lifted it from despair to destiny. The crippled man who had once been told his life was over had carried an entire world on his shoulders, and somehow, he never let it fall. Franklin D. Roosevelt's story is one of those rare lives that remind us what human resilience truly means. When history looks back on his time, it doesn't see a man defined by his paralysis, but a leader defined by his power to rise above it. He proved that physical limits can never confine the strength of the spirit, and that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to move forward despite it. Roosevelt's leadership changed forever how the world viewed government, democracy, and hope. Before him, many believed that leaders should remain distant, strong but untouchable. Roosevelt broke that distance. Through his warm, fatherly voice on the radio, he made millions of people feel that their president was sitting beside them, speaking directly to their fears and dreams. He taught a nation that leadership is not about ruling from above, but about standing beside people when they need it most. His New Deal reshaped the very foundation of American society. It brought relief to the poor, protection to the elderly, and dignity to the working class. It also redefined the role of government, proving that compassion and justice could be as vital to democracy as freedom and enterprise. For many Americans, Roosevelt didn't just save the economy, he saved faith in the future. Internationally, his vision extended even further. Out of the ashes of 2 world wars, he dreamed of a structure that could safeguard humanity from repeating its darkest mistakes. The creation of the United Nations, realized shortly after his death, stands as a living monument to that dream. Through it, Roosevelt's belief in cooperation, dialogue, and shared responsibility continues to guide nations even today. But perhaps his most enduring lesson is personal. Roosevelt once said, "A smooth sea never made a skilled sailor." And indeed, his own life was proof of that truth. The storms he faced, disease, depression, and war, forged him into one of the most remarkable navigators in history. He never allowed pain to make him bitter or fear to make him silent. Instead, he used suffering as a bridge toward empathy, turning his weakness into wisdom. When you think of Franklin D. Roosevelt, imagine a man sitting in his wheelchair, looking out across a troubled world, refusing to give in to despair. Imagine a voice, calm yet commanding, reaching through the static of an old radio, telling millions of anxious hearts, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." That voice did not just comfort a generation, it helped shape the conscience of the free world. And so, his legacy lives not only in history books, but in the belief that one person's courage can ignite hope in millions. Now, let me ask you, when life challenges you, when you face your own Great Depression, what kind of leader will you be for yourself and for others? And that was the story of Franklin D. Roosevelt, the man who could not walk, yet led a nation to stand tall. From the depths of despair to the highest seat of power, his life became a living testament to what it means to rise when the world expects you to fall. He taught us that true strength doesn't come from the body, it comes from the mind, the heart, and the will to keep moving forward when everything else stops. He showed that leadership is not about perfection or privilege, but about courage, compassion, and faith in people. Roosevelt's voice still echoes across time, calm, steady, reassuring, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Those words are not just for the 1930s, they are for every one of us, in every era. Whenever life feels uncertain, whenever challenges seem too heavy to bear, remember his journey. Remember that even from a wheelchair, he lifted a nation to its feet. So as you close your eyes tonight, think about what kind of new deal you can make with yourself, one built on courage instead of fear, on hope instead of despair. Because, like Roosevelt, you too carry within you the power to rebuild, to inspire, and to lead, even in the darkest times. Thank you for watching, and as always, welcome back to WSE English Story, where learning English becomes a journey through history, courage, and the human spirit.